Okay, so it's great to be back to my alma mater, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and actually one of my dissertation advisors, Dick Schultz, is sitting over here as professor of security studies, so he advised my dissertation on the role of civil resistance in 3 self-determination movements. So it's great to be back and great to see my old professors. So I am going to be talking about the most important actors in any nonviolent struggle. So we know by day 3 that the external actors are determinative, decisive, and they call all the shots, right? No, no, that's not the right answer. No, by now you've learned that civil resistance and how people organize their skills, knowledge, know-how is actually more important than the role of outside actors. But needless to say, because we're all outside actors, it's worth thinking about the roles, good, bad, and whatever, that outside actors can play vis-a-vis nonviolent movements. So we're gonna start off with a little exercise. I heard like this group likes to talk, so it's not gonna be hard to get your views. So we're going to start off with a little exercise, and I'm going to ask you, or I'm going to make a statement, a really bold statement. And when we're in Washington, we make bold statements all the time. Like sometimes they're backed by data and sometimes they're not, but we're bold and we're confident when we make our statements in Washington. So if you agree with the statement, you're going to go like this, fist, Ivan from Otpor, yes, resist. If you disagree with the statement, you're going to do this. Stop. No. Okay, you got it? It's like easy. Okay. All right, so the first statement, we're going to start with the most controversial one related to external actors in the role. Sorry? There's no middle way? No. It's my way or the highway. Black and white, baby. Okay, so the first statement is about foreign funding. Foreign funding, including human rights and democracy assistance, is the kiss of death for local activists and nonviolent movements. Agree that foreign funding is the kiss of death? Disagree. And I'm going to call on a couple of you from each side to defend your view. So agree, kiss of death, problem, bad. Okay. Oh, all right, yeah, you can put agree or disagree now. So these are the agrees. Agree, it's a kiss of death. Disagree. What if you both agree? You can't do that. We've already established this. Disagree. Yes, kiss of death. This is maybe an American term. It means it like kills the movement. It's bad. It's like kiss it and it dies. Like kiss of death. Fatal. Fatal. Who came up with that English word? Yes, fatal. Very good. Okay, so for someone who agrees that foreign funding, including human rights and democracy assistance, is the kiss of death, tell me why you think it's fatal. Yes, sir. Ed Knowledge.
I think my experience is the regime takes advantage of arguing that the foreign funding is meant for regime change and it's meant for kind of like foreign occupation, and they want to destabilize the country. And it becomes easier to mobilize conservative individuals against activism.
Okay, it's easy for foreign governments to declare that you're following a foreign agenda, and easy for them to divide movements because of that. Yes. What else? Kiss of death. Hold on, Busan.
Yeah. So basically, like I think it does not allow organic growth of the movement. So in case of Nepal, for instance, like anything that has to do with foreign funding, that is seen even from the other people, from the neutral mass or the swingers, that is they are skeptical about it. And also for me, like the more important thing is like it doesn't allow the organic growth of the movement, so thereby jeopardizing its own strength.
You lose the local rootedness nature of the movement, which we all know is very important. One more, and then we're going to go to people who disagree.
Suspicion inside of the movement, and it also gives media stuff to the government.
Yeah. Create suspicion. Who got money? Who didn't get money? Where's that money going to? Is it paying for someone's BMW, or where's the money going? Something like that. Okay, now for people who disagreed with that statement, why is it not the kiss of death? Yes, sir. From Pakistan.
This kiss of death point of view is taking this whole complex phenomenon oversimplistically.
that
Oh,
we
dear.
put one statement in and the movement dies.
Mm.
It's not that simple. It's not that linear. It has to be various other factors that can be involved, and we have all been discussing and talking about this. So one element can be affecting the whole process, but it cannot be the proverbial kiss of death.
Okay. But when can be helpful, for example? So why is it not the kiss of death?
Well, it's not because you have your own movement, indigenous movement. It's going on. It has initiated on your individual footing, and it can have support from the foreign elements. And when you have this variable of including the democratic things that the support that is coming in from the non-governmental organizations, then it further loosens the point. If it's only for this very purpose, the foreign help is coming in, then it can be some sort of having some ground. But on the other hand, if you include everything that is coming into our society, the health focus, the education focus, the water and sanitation focus, including this thing, that can be helpful in many ways in funding. That can be helpful in dispelling some of the fears. Yes, it can create doubt, but giving it a big statement that's a kiss of death, it's oversimplification.
Okay. So there's some useful things for money then. Yes, in the almost back. That's you.
Oh, okay. So while I need to agree that it is a political liability to accept foreign finances, and I also was for the soldier of George Soros and that sort of thing in my home country, I also think that there are certain contexts in which it is a necessity that needs to be dealt with. So it has its difficulties, but then it is also necessary. So, and even in important historical examples, I mean, the Black Civil Rights movement was partially financed by northern sources, and then the ANC was partially financed by Soviet countries. So it's just like something you, and those were also political liabilities, but that is something you just deal with because the movement has a lot of political liabilities usually. So that's like just business as usual to deal with this.
Right. Okay. Very good. Maybe two more quick ones in the middle row.
I think the coordination costs of is something that can be taken care of with external funding. And from my experience is that we sometimes have to meet outside of the country, and that is actually quite expensive, which can barely be, or that facilitates.
Mm-hmm. So convening outside of the country costs money and somebody has to pay for it. And it's not always easy to raise funding locally. All right, one more here and then we're going to go on.
I think it's a lesser evil versus not having any funding at all, especially when you work with poor communities that lack funding. And the fact is, I cannot deny the fact I am here and this is funded by ICNC and this is foreign funding too.
It is foreign funding. Yes. All right, because you've been super persistent.
I think the way Iqbal has said, it's simplicity when you say that, because this is a need-driven process. And you can't kill a need with foreign funding. And sometimes you may need resources to do them. So that is important. So I think basically the whole thing is about the need, and that you have that energy to do that, whatever you want to do. And you get some little resources to do it, why not?
Okay. Very good. So it's obviously not a black and white issue. I was just joking about that. There are shades of gray, and we'll dive a little deeper, but it's very good to get your sort of initial sense about some of these themes. Second and final question, sanctions. Sanctions as a key element of external support. Sanctions are helpful forms of external support to deter repression coming from the regimes. Agree, disagree. Agree, disagree. One more time. Sanctions are helpful forms of external support to deter repression. Agree, disagree. Okay, where are the agrees? All right, agree in the back. Why?
Yeah, I do agree because in certain kind of governments, like in Madagascar, they are much more sensitive to external pressure than from internal pressure. So when foreign countries get a ban on the country or get sanctions, they are more likely to react, the government, I mean, than if we activists claim our rights or whatever, they just ignore us.
Okay, so the need for sometimes outside pressure to use leverage against regimes. Yes, you.
Yes, in my country.
Which is?
Roger.
Zim. I'm going to guess your country. Okay, the country of Roger. Yes. Beautiful place. Burkina Faso. Okay.
The national authorities are very vulnerable from international pressure. For example, during the attempted coup in September 2015, when the African Union stated that the putschist was terrorist, this was a field using internally to mobilize more people to support and
Right.
to bring down these guys. So I think we need international support, international condemn to more mobilize ourselves inside.
Okay, diplomatic isolation and pressure, again, can be helpful vis-a-vis some intransigent regimes. One more agree, and then we'll go to disagree. Someone who hasn't spoken the whole institute. This is going to be hard with this group. All right, you in the back. Yes, Colombia.
Yeah, I agree because, for example, now in the case of Venezuela, the Organization of American States is trying to activate the Democratic Charter. That means that they activate this, they are going, well, they have to recognize that they're not being democratic and that they have to, go away from the organization, you know. And this is difficult for an state to recognize that they're no longer a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
The new Secretary General, he's putting pressure and international pressure on this. He also prepared a super big research about the regime of Venezuela and how this is going to work. And I think it's gonna work. Of course, it's not the best sometimes because if we isolate Venezuela, it's gonna be more space for the government to do more stuff to the civil society.
Okay.
But it can work.
Okay. How about people who are vehemently disagreeing about sanctions? Just looking around, who I haven't heard their beautiful voice. You. Or no, you were stretching, never mind. All right, right next to you.
I don't think sanctions have always worked. And in certain cases, they give governments an opportunity to use other means to sustain the military and their supporters. And ultimately, it's the citizens that are affected. In Burundi at the moment, there are sanctions on the government. The government is using equipment leased to peacekeeping operations in Somalia to fund the army. And ultimately, so far, it's the citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So they've not always worked. It's the same with the apartheid regime. There were sanctions, but that meant the government looked at other countries that were sympathetic to them. And they were able to fund their machinery.
So there are always ways to get around sanctions, and then that can help enrich and empower an elite if they find a way around sanctions, which can be problematic. All right, two more, and then we're going to wrap.
Yes, I would like only to emphasize what Dave had just said about Burundi, because I'm from Burundi, and our country is one of the most, the poorest countries in the country, and we depend on poorest countries in the world. So we depend on more than half of our budget from foreign, support. But with the current situation in Burundi, most of our donors, suspended their aid because of mass violation of human rights in Burundi. But until now, we see that the government is still resisting. So we are trying to understand if these sanctions are really effective, because we have, major donors like the European Union and other donors who suspended the aid, but the regime is still there and is still opposing, what international community wants for the government to negotiate with the opposition and civil society organizations. So I can say that, of course, economic pressure or pressures can work, but I don't know, but it may take a long time to work, because until now we see that our government is still resisting to all this kind of pressure.
Okay. Maybe one more. Yes.
Okay, so I think sanctions can have their usefulness in
less repression.
Okay, excellent points. And of course, we know there are different variations of sanctions. There are blanket sanctions, there are sector-specific sanctions, then there are sanctions that target individuals and their assets and their ability to fly to countries and buy luxury items.
The one we need.
So there's like different gradations of sanctions, and certain may be more or less relevant in different contexts. But bottom line, there's no black or white on these things. So do external actors matter? So just, by way of introduction, yes, a few years ago, I wrote with Erica the book, Why Civil Resistance Works, later went on to serve in the US State Department, and was deployed to 2 conflict zones, to Afghanistan and to Turkey, to work with the Syrian opposition. And most of my work, frankly, since then has involved working with the policy community, and helping them think about, okay, if movements are important historically, if they have this impressive track record, even against really tough opponents, as you guys have been discussing the past few days, then what does it mean to help them, or at least not harm them? So this is sort of the policy question that is driving me now. And the interesting thing is that there's actually not a lot of data out there on the role of external actors vis-a-vis nonviolent movements. There are a lot of sort of single case studies, some anecdotal information. Some people have attempted to create frameworks for different kinds of support, but we actually don't know in any great detail what role governmental, non-governmental actors have played in influencing the trajectories and outcomes of nonviolent movements. So bearing that in mind, Erica and I decided that it's been too long since we've written a book together, and we need to come together and write another book. So we're actually going to examine the role of external actors vis-a-vis nonviolent movements. So Erica, as always, is the data person. So we'll be collecting data on 78 post-2000 maximalist campaigns from the data set, and I will be doing more of the interviews, case studies with policymakers. Because what we know and what you've heard, I started this session with a joke about external actors being decisive and the most important. They can play important roles, they can play important positive and negative roles, but at the end of the day, nonviolent movements succeed because they attract mass, diverse participation bases. And they do that because the local actors are legitimate and are seen as legitimate, and they use innovative tactics. And these are things that outside actors simply cannot do and cannot achieve. There's no button to push for outside actors, whether they're in powerful governments or in the United Nations or in clever NGOs, that can inspire and sustain effective participatory movements. So external actors, as we'll talk about, can be important, but they're always going to be secondary. And there was actually a great report written about democratic breakthroughs. So what are the conditions that need to be in place to support democratic breakthroughs? Somebody's listening to French radio. I'm not gonna single you out, but anyway, so the role is secondary, but so this study of democratic breakthroughs is basically what the author Ray Jennings found, and he looked at dozens of different democratic breakthroughs, is that external actor support can provide some catalytic support, some timely support, and can help with an enabling environment, but on its own, external interventions, influences were never enough to achieve successful democratic breakthroughs. But when we're thinking about external support, and we'll talk in a second about the actors and the types of support, you can roughly think about it in terms of 2 broad categories of support. So the first broad category, the roles that external actors can play, is helping to create an enabling environment. So helping to shape the environment, whether that's mitigating repression used by regimes or constraining that repression, whether that's denying elite leaders with funds and ability to travel, more in the sanctions space, whether it's working sometimes with governments to create a legal enabling environment for civil society and NGOs. So the first sort of category, which is indirect, has to do with the space, helping to create and ensure that space exists for nonviolent civil society to exist, to organize, to mobilize, to bring about change. You all have probably talked a little bit about this closing space phenomenon. Has closing space come up in the conversation. So an interesting phenomenon, very negative trend that's happening around the world is clampdowns on civil society that's happening around the world. There's somebody here from Civicus. Who's our Civicus person? You. So Civicus, I like them because they've been tracking the space for civil society now for the past 3 years, and they come out with great reports every year. And so they've been following this negative trend of governments imposing very restrictive laws on domestic people who are dissenting, who are protesting. So very restrictive laws that deny or restrict foreign funding or foreign assistance. This has become rampant around the world. So they've come up with a whole series of their own tactics, as we've been discussing, to shut down civic space. And so this whole category of how to open it up and the role of external actors therein is actually quite important as we're seeing the space shrinking globally. And then secondarily, provision of direct support. Now here's where there's some controversy, of course, because we talked about money and the pros and cons of money and providing direct support to movements that thrive because they're local, they're authentic, and they have local legitimacy. So, but at the same time, as others were saying, sometimes it's very difficult to secure local funding for activist activities, movement activities. Sometimes it's tough to expand your activities to different geographies and communities without funding. So there's a role for this. So those are the two very broad categories of external support. So we're not going to have time to go through all these categories in any detail, but these are the types of external actors that Erica and I are going to be studying for the purpose of this book project. And so looking at, the role of foreign governments. Now, governments, as you've heard, are not monolithic, right? So governments are made up of parts that deal with pure diplomacy, others that deal with security and defense, others that deal with economic factors and development. And even within the same government, and I can speak a little bit from experience here, there are divisions about what to do in certain countries and which aspects to emphasize. There are some people who come down very strong on the human rights situation and the democracy situation, whereas sometimes the security folks will be, yes, this is all important, but we have immediate counterterrorism concerns, and we have to address those. And human rights and democracy is important, but step by step. So let's deal with the immediate sort of crises first. So, in doing preliminary research for the book, for me it's always interesting to see the divisions, profound divisions that have played out just within the US government on certain issues. So we have from Philippines, the interesting case of Marcos during the Reagan administration was, the Reagan administration, this was the fight against communism, and as Erica mentioned, Americans are, when it comes to communism, it's an issue. And so during the Cold War, there was a great focus on maintaining military presence in that area. Marcos was seen as sort of a bulwark against the expansion of communism. So there's very strong support within the Reagan administration. But there was a discussion, a real debate about whether to support the opposition during that time, because the fear was that if the opposition wins, this is in the 80s, what led up to the People Power Revolution, if the opposition wins, they will kick us out militarily, the Maoists will take power, the communists will take power, and this is a disaster for US policy. Another camp basically argued if we don't support the people, if we don't support the democratic opposition, this is going to come back and actually harm us because this regime is no longer legitimate and we will be seen as backing a very illegitimate regime. And so anyway, so there was a lot of debate. The latter camp ultimately prevailed. And I can say that the one finding that Erica and I had in the first book, Why Civil Resistance Works, about external actor roles, is that it seems that the withdrawal of patron support from an incumbent regime is very important. So the US government eventually telling Marcos it's time to get on our jet and go to Hawaii was very, very important. The same thing for the Shah. So the withdrawal of patron support for an incumbent regime is strongly correlated with the success of the nonviolent movement. So in terms of acts of omission and commission, this is an act of omission that's very, very important statistically. I should say we also found in the first book that direct state support to nonviolent movements did not correlate or did not seem to correlate with the success of the nonviolent movement. This is very preliminary initial data, so direct state support to the movement did not correlate, but non-state support to the movement in the 3 years leading up to the peak mobilization did seem to correlate with success of the nonviolent movement, which is a little bit interesting when we think about these different categories of external actors. So, so when it comes to governments, understanding that they're not monolithic and that there are divisions within them can actually work to your advantage in certain cases, because the key is identifying the people that and the bureaus, the agencies, the individuals who do support what you're trying to do and try to work with them as much as possible. But at the end of the day, your work is focused on building a broad-based movement within the country. So in terms of intergovernmental organizations, I have the picture here of a great Kenyan, Mai Kiai. Does anyone know Mai Kiai? Maina Kiai, sorry. Oh my God. I just spoke to him last week. Yeah. Thank God. Yes. Good guy. So Maina Kiai, I'm just singling him out because he is the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Maina has been doing sort of God's work in terms of shining a light on the shutdown of civic space that's happening around the world, creating reports, emphasizing that people have a right to freely associate, to protest, to go. And so he is a big voice at the UN in terms of shining a light on some of these issues. So if he's not someone, or this special rapporteur is not something you've heard of or know of, I encourage you to I can talk with you more about it, or just getting to know the reports that they're doing in the type of activities, because they're allies within the UN system. In terms of, has anyone heard of the Community of Democracies? Yes. What about the Community of Democracies? What do you know about them?
This is an organization which connects it started from seven countries, but now it's become bigger. The member of this organization, and they give interesting place for discussion. For example, they have a minister meeting, and this space for NGO, private sector, and government, when they can discuss this problem. So this is the good opportunity and good platform for discussion the issue about human rights or something.
Right. So it's about 120 some odd democratic countries around the world came together in the year 2000, essentially to act as a bloc internationally to advance democratic development and human rights. Not a perfect body by any stretch of the imagination, but one part of the Community of Democracies that I would flag for you all that relates to your work is there is a working group on enabling environments within the Community of Democracies. It's probably the most effective of the parts of the CD. It's Canadian-led, but supported by the US government, the Swedish government. They deal specifically with crackdowns on civil society, with restrictive laws, and they organize diplomatic pressure to push back. So think of the CD, and especially this working group, as a potential ally for the work that you're doing. And I know that Nicola is probably going to be talking, or has already talked about, the UN human rights system and the EU human rights system and the different bodies there. So I'm not going to go into, are you, Nicola? Somehow.
On it briefly yesterday, but I will be putting up a two-pager with all the links and information on it. Thank you for mentioning that.
Okay, very good. Because it's very good to know these different types of mechanisms. World Bank, there's a World Bank person here. You. Are you with the World Bank? You. I said maybe there are two from the World Bank. So the World Bank, I'll just flag because I've noticed, being in Washington, that the bank is increasingly interested in movements. Not in terms of how do we support movements, but why do they care about these actors? Because they care about good governance, they care about transparency and accountability, so they care about how people are mobilizing from the grassroots to address sources of corruption. And is anyone from Sudan here? Sudan. So Garifna has done, as a part Diaspora Group, has done a lot of work in terms of translations and getting media attention on what's happening in Sudan and the nonviolent protests. So this seems to be, and fundraising seems to be very important roles for Diaspora Groups. You know, when for labor groups, I'll just skip down. Labor is very important because workers know how to organize and mobilize. So there's actually a history of transnational labor solidarity that's been very important in places like South Africa. Is there Tunisia? So Tunisia, for example, there was a lot of relationships and advocacy involving international labor unions with the trade and labor unions in Tunisia, which played a very, very important role in the nonviolent revolution that led to Ben Ali's ouster. So labor unions and the show of solidarity involving labor has, in a number of cases, proven to be quite important. In terms of corporations, I would just note one thing about that, because corporations can play good and bad roles, as we all know, especially in the extractive industries space, so oil, gas, and the like. But have folks here heard of the voluntary principles for human rights and security? Yeah? Nico, do you want to tell us a little bit about it? No, Nico, not Nicola.
Provides a platform for engagement with companies to see how they're doing, companies and governments.
Yeah, so it's a multi-stakeholder initiative, and it's just worth knowing because we know that often some of the most egregious human rights violators are corporations in the extractive space. And so this is an initiative that involves governments, corporations, militaries, and civil society coming together to talk about practices involving the extractive industries that are violating rights and creating greater instability and insecurity. So voluntary principles for human rights and security, because it may be it may have relevance to your country and what you're working on, is worth knowing about. What's that? Nico. He's the go-to person then for the voluntary principles. And just a couple other things in this that I would note, and it has to do with where foreign governments and INGOs come together. Has anyone heard of the Civic Space Initiative, CSI? Any Swedes here? Sweden. Great country. Somebody here is working with the Swedes, though. I saw something about Sweden. Maybe Afghan embassy in Sweden, I don't remember. Anyway, there's a Sweden connection, I know, in this room, unless the person didn't show up. But the Swedish government has been funding something called the Civil Society Initiative, CSI, which is very much focused on an enabling legal environment. And it's an interesting coalition that brings together Article 19. Folks know this organization? Very creative. Article 19 is driving the right to protest movement, which is building international support for the fact that people have a right to protest. So Article 19, great organization. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL. Doug Rootson heads this organization. Civicus is the third, and the World Movement for Democracy. So I know at least a couple of you have a NED, National Endowment for Democracy. So this is part of the NED. So the Civic Space Initiative, is very much focused on pushing back against authoritarian pushback and opening up space. The other one I would flag for you is the Civil Society Innovation Initiative. Have anyone heard of CSII? I'm only saying because you'll likely end up meeting someone who's involved in these initiatives. So this is an initiative that grew out of President Obama's Stand with Civil Society initiative, again, focused on closing space. And the whole purpose, and it's jointly funded by the USAID in the US government and the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, along with two private foundations, including Aga Khan. And the whole purpose of CSII is to create 8 interlinking regional hubs. So places where activists and other civil society can meet, can talk about how to address closing spaces, share resources, share connections. And so since these hubs are just in their infancy and are being created in all the regions where you're from, it's worth knowing about, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it later. So those are some of the actors where you've already and we've discussed the types of support in terms of financing, provision of financial assistance for organizations to be able to organize, mobilize, do actions, that there are pros and cons to that. And I'll be talking in a second about a survey that was conducted with over 1,000 activists. It was a survey conducted by an organization called RISE, which was asking them about their experiences with these different types of support. So I'll show you the results of this survey in a second. But I mean, I think as we've talked about, you know, ICNC is involved in other organizations in funding, training, and capacity building. And this seems to be something, and it's verified in the surveys, that activists in particular find very, very helpful. Being able to meet with activists like them, share experiences. This is a form of external support, of course, but it is directly involved in improving sort of skills building and capacity building. On this slide, I want to point out one thing, and it has to do with the Diplomats Handbook. Is anyone in this room, have you had a positive experience with diplomats in your country who have demonstrated either solidarity or have shown effective support for your campaign or movement? Has anyone directly experienced that? Yeah, let me hear a couple of these stories.
Our LGBT pride in Moldova is really getting a lot of anti-demonstrators, and we have representatives from the Italian embassy, from Swedish embassy, from many other embassies joining the pride, and that's why we actually have protection from police and stuff, and it's all possible.
So direct intervention to deter repression on a very sensitive in many countries issue and topic.
And they also issue statements in support of different issues that.
Yeah, excellent. Yes.
We have also the same support from France, from USA, when the diplomats came to the prison to visit our friends in prison, but also make public speech, public notes, and that was a great support for our people who are in prison.
Visiting people in prison, attending their trials, showing direct support. The eyes and ears of the international community are shining.
Protection for them.
Yes, a form of protection. Other? Yeah.
Yes, so in my country, Burundi, I remember that some diplomats used to go to see, for example, injured people in hospitals, especially during the demonstrations, because the police was shooting directly in the demonstrators, and many people died. And for those who were injured, you know, some diplomats used to go to see them, you know, to
Yeah.
for encouraging them, and some messages of encouragement.
Again, eyes and ears are on these individuals' plights, and people know that they're watching them from the outside. Yeah.
For us, when we started documenting human rights violations in the extractive sector, the diamond sector, the diplomats from the Western world, they would receive our reports and circulate them to their governments, who are members of the Kimberley process. And they would meet them every month. They would also mobilize financial resources for us to keep on documenting. So in the end, the Kimberley process intervened 1 year later, mainly because of that linkage with Western diplomats.
Yeah. Great. Others? Yeah.
Actually, one of our very much known opposition leader was snatched from Yemen on his way to Eritrea. And we actually had to put pressure on the British government. And what happened was the British ambassador in Ethiopia was able to see him. And it's only that person who was actually witness to us, that it was only him who was able to, for us, it's just a hand. We saw him and said, he's alive.
So again, powerful stories of like diplomatic witness and, you know, physical deployment as a deterrent element. Yes, sorry.
And we have experience when the diplomat mission invites like for press conference and for briefing, and time to time they support our statement to put their signature, and it's really pressing for it's give more like voices for our statement. Another one, we communicate with them before the UPR, Universal Periodic Report. We discussed it yesterday, and we give our recommendation for them to provide it to our government. And another one, we have like monitoring during the hearing in the vote against human rights defenders and visit in the prison.
So at times, diplomats, especially if it's a multilateral initiative, meaning it's diplomats from different countries who are issuing a statement, it can be very powerful in legitimizing the work that you all are doing in the field. And the other part is, you know, I'm sure at least half of this room, although we could do hands, at least half of this room, I'm sure you've been called either agitators, subversives, maybe terrorists, maybe extremists, and maybe traitors by your governments. So what, all right, raise your hand if you've been called one of those things. Let's see it. All right, yeah, I figured it was a lot of you. This institute tends to attract your type. That's a good thing. It's not meant to be negative. So what diplomats can do helpfully in many cases is offer like a diplomatic imprimatur and sign of legitimacy that what these people are doing, they may or may not agree with them, by the way. They may not agree with the statements in their protests and the type of tactics, but they're able to say these are legitimate entities with legitimate voices, and when they meet with governments, and you should take them seriously. And that's something that diplomats can do usefully. One more on diplomats. Yes.
In Venezuela, the Vatican embassy tried to run mediation for the release of political prisoners.
Mm.
The government didn't do that.
So you mean the Vatican pressed for the release of political prisoners, but they didn't heed to? Okay. So an example of it not being particularly effective. All right, one more.
One problem we have with the diplomats is because when the diplomats say something, they do it in the diplomatic dialogue, the diplomatic speech, you know. In some cases, it's not fit to what we expect them to tell. We say they are very soft to the regime or to the authorities. But this is a diplomatic. Some of my friends don't like that. They say, he's telling not the truth. But I tell them, listen at what he's saying. He's saying in his diplomatic language, it means something.
Yeah.
For you not, but for him and for the regime and for everything. He has to be diplomatic. He has to show up as neutral and not always on our side or on our opposite.
Do you know why that's the case, though, about using diplomatic language? Because diplomats are trained, first and foremost, in maintaining bilateral relations with governments. That's like, training block number one is how to maintain relations with governments, because you have to stay in country. And so you sometimes have to use certain language so that you're not antagonizing a government too much. But in certain cases, I'm sure folks here have examples where diplomatic statements and démarches, so démarches are very specific diplomatic channels where you are, asking a government to do a specific thing or to stop doing a specific thing. It's called a démarche. And these can have very pointed language in them. But, diplomacy like nonviolent resistance is an art as much as it's a science. And so you have to know in certain cases what type of language, what tone of language, whether it's a megaphone diplomacy or whether it's a private type of diplomacy is going to be most effective, and which type of action is least likely to imperil other activists. And diplomats are always aware that if they make too pointed of statements, they actually could be putting more people at risk by doing that. So it's something that actually but I know from an activist perspective, you're probably often dissatisfied with the watered down, soft nature of statements to government. So I hear you and I respect that as well. In the rules of the game. But your job as activists is to get diplomats to think not about other rules, but about sort of giving them confidence that if they go a little bit outside of the box with what they're doing, it's not a terrible thing. And diplomats look to what people in the societies are doing. So you actually have more power vis-a-vis diplomats from other embassies than you may think.
I think in Israel it's actually in Palestine, there's a great example of that, how the EU and different countries build all kind of housing for Palestinians in illegal building. And then when Israel, the army come and destroys the building, there's a diplomatic event happening. And it's actually, the buildings are there initially, even though it's built illegally by Israel, in order for this event to happen. And if it happens, it becomes like an international issue and not just a Palestinian issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Israel is a tough sort of, yeah. Just saying. We'll leave it at that.
Maybe you may pick Kenya. When last year, when Hassan and Hussein here, when they said yesterday, the government came to us, Haki African Huri, and they froze our accounts and
Right.
our activities. The only thing that helped us a lot, apart from the community that we serve, are the diplomats.
from, if I'm not mistaken, specifically Norway.
Norway. Even
Yeah.
there was a hashtag from the government, Norway supports terror.
That's right.
And you know Kenyans in Twitter the way they are. So
Good or bad?
they are venomous.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually a great example, and it was one that I was actually paying quite close attention to because Muhuri was declared a terrorist. You know, it's like, why don't they come up with new names to call it? It's like terrorist is getting old. But so Muhuri was called they probably will. Muhuri was called a terrorist, and then the Norwegian embassy was so quick to say, they're not terrorists, and we will continue to support them financially and otherwise. So they were very quick to the draw on that. And this is frankly where diplomats can be helpful. I would just note for you, so you're aware of this resource, the Diplomats Handbook. This is accessible online. Have folks heard about this? Because when you're interacting with diplomats, and this is a handbook for diplomats who are from all democratic countries. This was initially a Community of Democracies project, incidentally. And what I love about the Diplomats Handbook is that it not only has country-specific case studies in it, but it has a whole range of tools. Everything from convening to connecting to physical deployment to granting amnesty. So the full range of tools that diplomats have to support dissidents and to support democratic transitions. And it's good for you to have this knowledge and resource in your arsenal when you're meeting with diplomats, because ask them if they know about this and if they're using X, Y, and Z. And it's gives you some good power vis-a-vis them. One last point about this, and it's the preventing, mitigating repression. Because I tend to think this is probably one of the most important roles outside actors can play, is using diplomatic and other means to put pressure on governments so they don't repress their citizens. I'm particularly interested in the role of the security forces in this space, as Professor Schultz knows, because what is sometimes difficult is when US government and other governments are giving huge amounts of security assistance and assistance cooperation to militaries in other countries who are involved in some way in whether it's human rights abuses or suppressing civic space and the like. And so I'm more believing than ever before that the security community needs to be part of this conversation about closing civic space around the world. And we need to think about how, because this is hundreds of millions of dollars, at least when it comes to US security assistance going to governments. And we need to be connecting that security assistance in a very fundamental way to good governance metrics and to democratic metrics, and make that support conditional to a certain degree on meeting those benchmarks. Because you see time and again that you have, democracy assistance and human rights assistance going to civil society in certain countries, Uganda, and massive amounts of military assistance that's often working at cross purposes. And somehow these communities need to be coming together to talk about why suppression, and there are positive steps, Leahy laws and the like, but why good governance and creating open space for civil society is at the end of the day good for security. And so this point bears repeating. So won't spend a lot of time on this, but I would just note that Eric and I are going to look at the role of external actors and assistance in different phases of the movement. So we're going to look at 3 years before the peak mobilization, during the peak mobilization, and after. A quick go around. Which types of assistance of the ones we've talked about or you experience do you think are most important in the pre-campaign phase? So in the 3 to 5 years leading up to, say, a mass movement. What matters in this time period? What is it?
Knowledge sharing, education.
Learning, sharing, education, yes. Training, capacity building. What else is particularly useful during this time? Yeah. Human rights? Fundraising, yes. Fundraising. You can't start fundraising like, the day before a mass protest. What's that? Networking. So connecting people to others. And we're going to go quickly because the survey results I think you'll find interesting in this space. But what about when you're in the heat of the moment? So a mass movement, whether it's Maidan, Tahrir, whatever, what matters during that time period?
During the campaign, unity.
So external actors helping to support unity between different opposition elements, for example? Convening, connecting that role? Yes. What's that? Discipline, helping them maintain nonviolent discipline. Yes?
Communication, telling the truth about what is happening.
Yes, when normal channels of communication are blocked, providing alternative sources of news and information.
They can give recognition to the problem, not to the campaign or to the movement.
Give recognition of what's going on in the moment. So shining a light on the interactions that are happening, what the movement is about, that sort of thing. Okay, what about the last phase? So during this, because there's a lot of talk about, there's focus on protest, and the resistance phase, but what about what comes after? What about how you go from protest to engaging in politics and engaging in political pathways? So what kind of support have you benefited from in this sort of post phase, if you will, even though we know these things are not linear, yeah. What about the post phase? What matters? What type of help is meaningful? Protection in the aftermath in certain cases? Economic support, especially if it's in a post-transition, helping the economy get back on its feet. What about other institutional elements? Constitution building, reforming electoral laws, security sector reform. So sort of these more hardcore institutional support, capacity building training tends to be quite important during this post phase. Two quick ones here.
Post phase, there was no clear identification of what happened, where the movement was successful, but who was to step in to carry this to the next level. And then in most cases in Africa, the military steps in and either reverses all the gains or takes the country to another level.
Right.
So in that particular phase, I think leadership is very key. Who steps in into that gap that has been created?
Who steps in? What are the mechanisms? How are people staying engaged? Did Peter Ackerman gave a checklist talk, right?
Yeah, he did.
Did he mention an additional point?
He did.
Oh, what's point number 7, Hardy?
An effective plan for transition.
Yeah, because we've seen in many cases with parts of the Arab Spring, Egypt being maybe a good example, where there was probably insufficient attention played to the type of activities and plan for what came after the fall of the regime. Because you invest a lot of energy as activists and movements in challenging these tough figures. And often I've experienced that activists are very hesitant and are reluctant to want to think about engaging with institutions and governments because they've been repressed by them or they've found them to be useless their whole lives. So why is your thinking going in the direction of how do I get engaged in an electoral reform process? It's not like a top and activist thinking, but the organizers, and you guys have probably discussed the difference between activists and organizers, the organizers within a movement have to be thinking about this because that's how you translate the power of the mobilization into actually institutional reforms. Dr. Marovic.
Just a quick comment on that. And sometimes it's not that they're not prepared for what comes after, but actually the coalition that is bringing about change has totally opposite views of what should come. And that's why there is no plan. Or actually, to be more, what should I say, truthful, there are 2 plans or 3 plans. And so the reason why transition doesn't work out is that actually these things were not reconciled. So we go back to unity.
Yeah.
Which has to be built long before.
And is there an important role for outside actors in helping to not negotiate but mediate between competing plans about what the aftermath should look like? Do you have any experience with this?
Well,
good or bad?
And we have to also consider there are so many outside actors, and that some would like a certain faction to prevail, some other actors would like another faction to prevail. We're going into the messy details of realpolitik.
Right.
But I think that this unity, they can outside actors can be helpful, but this unity needs to be built from the inside.
From the inside.
But I think the most important thing is it takes time, sometimes 10 years before the struggle even starts.
But the problem is foreign funding often is not super long term, right? It's very short term and very focused on the immediate, so it's hard to get support for that type of thing. Let's just go quickly through. We've addressed a number of these points, but it's, in thinking about the role of outside actors and the support they provide, in terms of thinking about the pros and cons of doing this. Now, we talked about legitimacy, that a potential disadvantage is that your agenda becomes associated with the foreign agenda, which delegitimizes you. There's a lot of research that's being done about NGOs, especially that are very closely associated with foreign agendas, because the funding, the way funding has been provided, has created dependency relationships such that literally the NGOs and CSOs are reporting to the foreigners and are justifying themselves to the foreigners more so than to their own people. So it creates sort of an unfortunate dependency relationship which undermines the legitimacy of the civil society sector. So this, and there's more and more research being done on that. We talked about, I mean, local ownership. Yeah, if the agenda, if the initiative is not coming from the local actors, the activists and the like, if they're not dictating or able to dictate to the donors and others what they should be supporting, what they should not be supporting, if they're not calling the shots, the funding can have sort of distorting effects and can help veer it away. And donors, somebody mentioned about diplomatic language. Donors sometimes aren't comfortable with civil resistance. Have you discovered this? So because it involves confrontation and disruption and like shaking up the status quo, but you know, there's often, it's not complete stupidity on their part why they don't embrace civil resistance. The reason is like they're accountable to many people, and if on their watch they provide assistance to a group that confronts security forces and they get killed, that's like a serious, serious problem for them. And so often donors are going to err on the side of caution and according to processes like advocacy and what are the traditional categories of? Yes. What else?
Reports.
Yes, reporting, so because these are things they're familiar with and, you know, and they're less controversial. But I think we're in a stage now where more and more donors actually are open-minded about why movements matter and why they're important. So the time is actually ripe now to make the case for why citizen organizing and nonviolent movements contribute to greater security, greater prosperity. And so we're in a space now where I think there's more open-mindedness about this, but it can be a tough sell for external actors. And then we talked about the advantages, the spotlight, the solidarity. When you talk to activists, the thing that often they cite the most about what is most helpful is people are watching on the outside. Our struggle is being monitored, and people are there to help us. So don't ever underestimate the non-monetary, the non-funding forms of external assistance, because at the end of the day, it's often the most important. We've talked about skill shares, and movements like compared to NGOs, CSOs, they actually don't need a ton of money when you think about it. The money that they need is generally, you know, for things in the moment to do some outreach, some training, equipment, but it's not like you're paying massive salaries, overhead, and all this kind of stuff. Movements don't need that, and it's a good sell for you vis-a-vis donors because they sometimes are responding to the pure economic. And then we talked about the violence repression, especially with security forces and diplomats. So we're gonna quickly talk about the results, and this is new, so I only just received the results of this study last week, so these are somewhat fresh. So at my other institutional home, the Atlantic Council, I'm co-leading a project called The Future of Authoritarianism. So we're looking at trends involving authoritarian regimes and in a policy sense, what can be done about it? What can be done about this closing of civic space around the world? So when we were having these roundtable discussions with policymakers, NGOs, some activists in Washington, someone brought up, and it wasn't me, but it was perfect. They were like, why don't we get activist voices in this study? Like, what do activists say about how to respond and about external support? And I said, perfect. So we, together with the Open Society Foundation, supported a survey that was conducted by an organization, as I mentioned, called RISE, and I think at least a few of you know or have met with, have worked with RISE, which is a small group that works with activists and movements globally. Got 1,107 activist responses from those countries, so closed, semi-closed, partially opening countries. The people who were responding to the survey came from movements, they came from NGOs, CSOs, networks, coalitions, all different types. They were working on democracy and human rights, they were working on LGBTI, they were working on peace building, they were working on corporate accountability, they were working on a very broad range of issues. And we were asking them three main questions. what is the prevalence, or how much outside support have you received, both in an individual capacity and in an organizational capacity? So everything was broken down by individual and organization. How did you perceive that external support? Was it helpful? Was it harmful? And then what kinds of outside support do you want? So let's see if these findings jive with what you all would say as we wrap up this session. This slide just basically shows the types and the level of outside support that were provided by different outside actors. So you can see we have about a dozen different external actors from INGOs, media, militaries, corporations, and the like, and the level of support as reported by the survey participants in the different countries. And there are about 50 charts associated with this study, which I'm happy to share, because the data was broken down by gender, rural, urban, country, obviously, education level, so it's a pretty sophisticated survey. First major finding was that the context for activism seems to be getting worse around the world, like everywhere, even in spaces that are open, and it's reinforced by the findings that people who are studying civic space, civicus, and others have found. So activists themselves are saying, in terms of freedom of speech, assembly, press, things seem to be getting worse. The one area where there's a slight improvement is freedom of internet, access to internet. That was the only area where there seemed to be in these countries a slight improvement. So then the survey respondents were asked about their most positive forms of support. So you can look at the possible responses, and I should note that there was both a sort of a A, B, C, D, E, F, G part of the survey and a qualitative stories part. So people were able to give narrative about their experience with these things. So it turned out that overall, training, media coverage, financial support to programs and campaigns, and access to networks were rated as having made the most positive difference to respondents' causes. And I think we've heard a lot of that coming up today. So those were sort of the most helpful. Now, in terms of what people said when they wrote their stories, the specific stories that they were describing about positive support very much focused on, perhaps not surprising to this group, the value of sharing strategic principles, advice, and ideas ranked number one in the survey. I was slightly surprised by that finding, but anyway, having the ability to swap stories about strategies, what's working, what's not, what's worked in other places, what hasn't, and sharing specific skills related to things like community organizing, leadership skills ranked very highly in this survey. So those were a few things that came out. As we heard today about external support, it can help legitimize a group when they're being declared bad things by their governments, that all they do is incite and they're subversive. Outside actors can help, in certain cases, legitimize that, and the respondents seem to put a lot of emphasis on that. But the major qualitative story was the ability to learn with and from other activists. So that sort of shot to the top of the survey in terms of what people found the most helpful. Funding, of course, it's not. So when it came to the funding question, it was a nuanced set of responses. So participants focused on the kinds of funding and the relationships that underpinned it. So, of course, activists preferred when donors did not have agendas that they were pushing on activists and other groups. So when agendas were not imposed, when the funding was flexible, so flexible funding as opposed to major chunks of funding, and when the funding allowed them to reach new communities. So that was coming up in some of the qualitative responses. And then we disaggregated the non-funding. So outside of money provided, what type of support did the respondents find most useful or helpful? Again, it was strategy support, practical, tactical, which I have to see the exact wording on that, but I think it's like provision of timely equipment, supplies, and the like, so practical forms although no, that can't be, because that would be considered a funding support. So I have to get the exact wording on what practical and tactical was. And then networking opportunities ranked very highly. So those were the positive. And the positive factors, so what are the factors that are most likely going to contribute to positive support? Yep, connections with other activists like them, respecting the agenda, focusing on building trust with the activists and civic actors, so the trust building aspect, and bringing timely financing to the table. So activists rated those all as highly on positive. So what were the negative experiences of organizational support? Not knowing the context, so coming in and thinking you know what's going on when you actually don't, imposing agendas from the outside, having a short-term focus, so very short-term and inconsistent. So there were a number of stories of activists who reported funding that started and then stopped, and they just never could rely on the form of support. So short-term, which when you think about it from a strategic perspective is problematic, because if donors in certain ways are short-term with their thinking, they're going to be encouraging recipients and activists to be short-term with their planning as well, which is not helpful. Too much paperwork. Has anyone had experience with filling out? Yeah, that tends to be that tends to be a difficult one. And the other negative was being too focused on their own reputations, vice what was happening locally. And then from an individual, so what the respondents cited as the most positive outcomes from individual participation in different forms of outside support. First and foremost, improved leadership skills, improved communication skills and strategy skills, a sense of solidarity, feeling part of a bigger movement, so seeing how your movement relates to what's happening in other places, more motivation and confidence, and strengthen relationships inside and outside of the country. So these were sort of the positive and negative, the positive at least, expressions. Now finally, last slide, for the survey, what activists said would be the most helpful. It may be things that they have not received, but what they say would be the most helpful forms of external support. Now, I asked the person who conducted the survey to give me a chart that, because everything looks very similar. What's the word for getting a chart where they're not like, there's a word for this, I know.
Completely uninformative. That's the word
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
use.
exactly. So this is, of all, I was like, I saw this and I'm like, oh, that looks like it's all like flatline, whatever. And maybe they were so close that it's, but I doubt it. Anyway, we'll talk about it after how to do this chart better. But the one element that I found really interesting, and it ties into what we discussed earlier, was protective accompaniment was very highly rated. So activists were saying having third parties come in, again, physical deployment to deter repression came to the top. But also, so accompaniment, security support, safe spaces, media coverage, legal support, having joint campaigns, and then another high-ranked one was diplomatic support for the campaign, so the things that we were talking about here. So these are like literally I just presented 3 or 4 out of about 50 different charts because I knew we wouldn't have time to go into detail. But that survey will be released more formally, officially within the next month. Everyone will have access to the details and to the information, and hopefully you'll find that useful. So last slide on adopting a movement mindset. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about since leaving the State Department. And having been in a position, especially working with Syrian activists, at a time when their movement was nonviolent against a really tough opponent, and not feeling that we on the outside, and I mean the collective we, not just the US government or the State Department, but the collective we, I felt was not up to the task when it came to providing outside support to the nonviolent activists. And so I've been thinking, and the results in the Syria case, of course, are tragic, but it's not the only example, and everyone in this room has their own example of inadequate or ineffective support. So I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean from an outsider's perspective, a donor's perspective, to approach work with a movement mindset. And I've honed in on a few things, and I would love to hear your reactions, things I'm missing, things that maybe need to be rethought. But I think the importance of listening to grassroots actors is really important. And I can tell you from a government perspective, it's not always obvious why, when you're doing visits and meeting with civil society, you should reach outside of the top 10 civil society leaders in the country. Everyone has their favorite 10. I mean, some people in this room are probably members of that 10, but diplomats get very used to embracing and inviting the same people in the country from the same organizations to like all the events. So just like being able to tease them to why is it important to engage with non-traditional actors, to people outside of capitals, to people from small groups that are not registered, you know, they may be marginalized, whatever, why that's important for you as diplomats and as donors to be able to have that access to listen to them, to hear, because we know at the end of the day that people at the grassroots level who are suffering from various repression, marginalization, and the like are in the best position actually and are the most motivated to fight back. And so you have to be working with them and hearing about them, their needs, their grievances, what they're doing, and focus on amplifying their voices. Because sometimes, again, you just don't have access. You don't speak the right English. You're not meeting with diplomats and with donors. So, you know, finding a way to reach them and amplify their voices, I think, is really important. Shoestring budget. So here's the big difference between, you know, being a member of an NGO or a big CSO and being a member of a grassroots organization. You know, what I found when I was, especially in Afghanistan, when I began to meet with some youth leaders and very non-traditional groups that were doing volunteerism in Kabul and elsewhere, and I remember being so impressed by one group that was youth-led, very focused on volunteerism. All their funding for their activities was coming from fellow Afghans. They were doing arts, so they later went on to do art lords. I don't know if anyone's been following the graffiti on the walls in Kabul. It's pretty awesome. And so I remember being so impressed by that group because they basically came and said, here's what we're doing. This is the type of activism we're involved in. Here's how we're mobilizing people. And, you know, weren't asking for money, basically. And they were saying, well, you know what? With or without donor funding, we're going to do this. So, you know, those are the people, frankly, that it's like, you know, you separate the women from the girls when you hear stories like that, and it makes you just realize these are the real deal. And they're able to do stuff and mobilize with a very small funding base. So they're focused. They're not going from water sanitation to, you know, security sector reform to something else, chasing donor agendas. They're focused on what they do and what they do well. And these tend to be like, you know, the type of people that are, you know, very helpful and the ones that you want to engage with. And they can mobilize. So, you know, the mobilizers in any society, the organizers are like priceless. They're the ones who get things done. And sometimes it's tough for diplomats and donors to be able to identify the real organizers and mobilizers because, again, they're used to dealing with the same folks in the same organizations. So money. Flexible surge funds tend to be more helpful for activists and movements than large sums of money that, you know, expand. So, but donor mechanisms are not always set up to provide quick, flexible surge funds. They're thinking this way. More and more donors are trying to figure out how to do flexible funding, and this is something you all need to advocate for. They need to hear it from all sides that you need to change how your funding is done. You need to change your monitoring and evaluation processes. They just need to keep hearing it. And I think slowly, you'll start to see some changes. And if you guys talked about local philanthropy, so particularly as civic space closes around the world, donors, of course, are in part responsible for the closing of civic space around the world because of the way they've been giving money and making groups vulnerable. So cultivating local sources of funding through local philanthropic activities, I think, is sort of the wave of the future. It's tough in many places because many regions don't have a philanthropic culture, but I think figuring out, when you think about sustainability and legitimacy and the like, cracking that nut is actually very, very important. Then, you know, coming up with new innovative ways to do training and coaching that's sustainable and that is starting to, like, more institutionalized peer learning. The ICNC Summer Institute is a great example of a way that brings people together in a structured way. You're able to meet each other, learn from each other, but we've got to figure out ways to build the capacity of trainers and coaches from different countries and regions to be able to do training and coaching on their own. So whether it's a coaching core, whatever it is, but more innovative ways to think about peer learning and training and coaching. Bridging traditional NGOs and civic movements. You all know from experience that the movement people and the CSO NGO people are not on the same page. There's a lot of distrust. They have the money, they have the access, we don't. There's a lot of malcontent between these groups. And I often often think it's unfortunate in many cases because if one is going in one direction, the other in the other, you don't have a unity of effort, and we know how important unity is for movements. So being able to bridge the divide and support the creation where appropriate, strategic alliances between NGOs, activists, and then with governments, because we all know there are good people in governments. There are reformers in governments that often are not incentivized to do anything different because they're either marginalized or they don't feel support. And so building bridges between the reformers and the activists and NGOs can be helpful. Finally, this is the point about the military and security. I think more and more, given the resource disparity between security assistance and sort of democracy, human rights, and the like, that finding ways and working with militaries to help them use their leverage and their trainings and their relationships to nudge their counterparts in a democratic direction and institutionalizing that is incredibly important. And it's something that we're more and more thinking about and focusing on.